Something I can help you with, gentlemen?
Sir, we need to see some identification or proof of legal status.
Legal status? Do you know who I am?
You fit the description of someone we're looking for. That's all I know, sir.
Call your supervisor. You don't want to do that.
All right, you're being detained until we verify your status.
ICE agent Bradley Morrison's body cam captured exact moment at 2:23 p.m. on sunny Thursday afternoon when he approached black man in professional suit exiting Walker Coffee in Riverside's historic downtown, immediately demanding to see immigration documents and proof of citizenship without any justification or reasonable cause beyond Mann's physical appearance. Mann was Commander James Patterson, Riverside Police Chief with 28 years in law enforcement, who just finished lunch meeting with City Council about community policing initiatives and was returning to his office 2 blocks away carrying meeting documents and coffee. Patterson was wearing professional gray suit with tie, carrying executive leather briefcase, and had every aspect of appearance and demeanor of high-ranking law enforcement official he was. But to Morrison, conducting unauthorized immigration sweep in commercial district, based on nothing more than racial profiling, sight of black man in public area, apparently, was sufficient to assume illegal presence in country and demand immediate documentation. What Morrison didn't know, what his racial biases and authority overreach didn't allow him to consider before confronting police superior in Patterson's own city, was he was about to create international incident, costing federal government millions, destroying his own career, exposing ICE's illegal practices, and becoming cited court case on constitutional limits of immigration enforcement. What happened in next 32 minutes, all captured by Morrison's body cam, security cameras from multiple businesses, and dozens of witnesses with cell phones, would generate 37 million views in 48 hours and force resignation of 3 high-ranking ICE officials. Before diving into this story, showing exactly what happens when federal agent decides black man must prove his citizenship in country where he was born, tell me, where are you watching from? If this is your first time here, hit that subscribe button and leave comment about what you think should happen to agents stopping American citizens demanding papers based solely on race, because this story will give you devastating satisfaction of seeing someone abusing federal authority losing absolutely everything. James Patterson was 54 years old and had dedicated entire life to law enforcement and public service. He'd grown up in Riverside, son of public school teacher and nurse, first person in his family to attend college where he studied criminal justice and sociology before joining Riverside Police Department at 23 as patrol officer. Over 3 decades, he'd worked every division of department, narcotics, violent crimes, internal affairs, eventually rising to captain before being appointed chief 5 years ago by City Council, recognizing both his law enforcement expertise and reputation for integrity and commitment to fair constitutional policing. As first black police chief in Riverside's 140-year history, Patterson understood symbolism and responsibility of his position, and he'd worked tirelessly to build trust between department and communities of color, historically experiencing over-policing and unequal treatment. Patterson was known nationally in law enforcement circles, had spoken at conferences about police reform, served on Department of Justice Task Force on community policing best practices, and been recognized with numerous awards for his work improving police-community relations, while simultaneously reducing crime. He had professional relationships with FBI directors, high-ranking officials in federal agencies, and police leaders across country. His office at police department had entire wall dedicated to commendations, photos with presidents and governors, certificates from advanced training in federal and international law enforcement. He was exactly type of high-ranking official federal agents should coordinate with, not confront on street, as suspect. That specific Thursday, Patterson had scheduled lunch meeting with 3 city council members to discuss proposed budget for new community policing initiative, increasing number of officers assigned to building relationships in historically underserved neighborhoods instead of simply responding to calls after crimes had already occurred. Meeting had gone well. Council members supported Patterson's vision and had indicated they'd likely approve necessary funding. Patterson was in good mood as he exited Walker Coffee where meeting had taken place, thinking about next steps for implementing program and mentally reviewing afternoon agenda, including briefing with his commanders on recent crime statistics. He was carrying coffee, briefcase with budget proposal documents, and was dressed exactly as he always dressed for professional meetings. Professional business suit, clearly signaling his position and authority. Bradley Morrison had been ICE agent for 7 years, most of that. Time spent in removals, unit conducting arrests and deportations of undocumented immigrants. Morrison was part of tactical enforcement team ICE department had sent to Riverside as part of larger sweep operation targeting areas where demographics suggested significant immigrant population presence. But instead of focusing on specific targets with warrants or credible intelligence information linking specific individuals to immigration violations, Morrison's team was conducting what was essentially mass racial profiling, stopping people of Latino or Black appearance in public spaces and demanding proof of legal status based on nothing more than physical appearance. Those tactics were constitutionally questionable and violated ICE's own guidelines on when agents could legitimately stop and question individuals about immigration status. But Morrison's supervisors had encouraged aggressive approach under political pressure to demonstrate high arrest numbers regardless of method's legality or constitutionality. Morrison had stopped 14 people that morning alone, demanding documentation from each, harassing Latino workers leaving restaurants, Black men waiting at bus stops, anyone whose appearance fit broad racial profile he was using as substitute for reasonable suspicion. Most people had provided some type of identification and been released, though several had complained of harassment and discriminatory treatment Morrison had ignored because he felt protected by federal authority and culture within ICE prioritizing arrest numbers over constitutional rights. When he saw Patterson exiting Walker Coffee, professionally dressed Black man in upscale commercial district, something about Patterson's profile apparently signaled to Morrison as potential target. Maybe it was just Patterson's race. Maybe Morrison assumed Black man in that area had to be worker rather than professional or businessman. Whatever reasoning, Morrison made decision, destroying his career and exposing ICE's illegal practices to national scrutiny. Morrison approached Patterson on sidewalk outside Walker Coffee, his hand already reaching for ICE badge while adopting authoritative posture he'd used with dozen other people that morning. He called out to Patterson, demanding his attention. And before Patterson could even respond, Morrison was demanding to see immigration documentation and proof of legal status. There was no polite request for identification, no explanation of why he was asking these questions. No acknowledgement he needed reasonable cause to stop and detain someone on immigration matters. Morrison simply assumed authority to demand Patterson prove his right to be in country, where Patterson had been born, raised, and served for decades in law enforcement. Morrison's body cam captured everything, captured his aggressive approach, captured Patterson's look of disbelief, transitioning to controlled anger, captured beginning of confrontation, becoming one of most documented damaging racial profiling incidents in federal immigration enforcement history. Patterson stopped completely and turned to face Morrison, his expression shifting from initial confusion to cold understanding of what was happening. As police chief with nearly 3 decades law enforcement experience, Patterson immediately recognized all red flags of what Morrison was doing: lack of articulable reasonable cause, obvious racial profiling, violation of constitutional guidelines on immigration stops. But as Black man having navigated racism in law enforcement for an entire career, Patterson also recognized dangerous power dynamic of being confronted by federal agent, clearly having no idea who he was harassing. Patterson responded in calm but authoritative voice, immediately signaling he wasn't person Morrison could easily intimidate, asking what was Morrison's legal basis for stopping him and demanding documentation. Morrison, unaccustomed to having his authority questioned by those he stopped, responded. He didn't need to explain anything, and refusal to cooperate with federal agent could result in arrest. That threat was massive tactical error because it revealed Morrison was operating without adequate legal foundation and trying to use intimidation instead of legitimate authority. Patterson, having trained hundreds of officers on constitutional limits of stops and searches, knew exactly Morrison was violating basic law enforcement standards. He responded calmly but firmly. He understood law perfectly. And unless Morrison had reasonable suspicion grounded in specific articulable facts he'd committed immigration violation, Morrison had no legal authority to detain him or demand documentation. Patterson also mentioned racial profiling didn't constitute reasonable suspicion under Fourth Amendment or under ICE's own policies, and stopping citizens based solely on racial appearance was not just illegal, but federal civil rights violation. Patterson's tone was educational but firm, as if he were correcting junior officer having exceeded authority, which, from law enforcement perspective, he was doing. Morrison clearly wasn't prepared to encounter someone knowing law better than him and who wouldn't be intimidated by federal badge. His response was to escalate confrontation instead of acknowledging error, demanding Patterson produce identification immediately, or he'd be detained for obstructing federal investigation. Patterson responded he'd be happy to show identification once Morrison articulated legal reasonable cause for stop, but providing identification under coercion without legal foundation would establish dangerous precedent and violate his constitutional rights. That refusal wasn't about being difficult or challenging authority. It was about police chief having dedicated career to constitutional law enforcement, refusing to participate in his own civil rights violation. Body cam captured entire exchange, documenting how Morrison couldn't provide any specific reason beyond vague description of conducting immigration sweep, not constituting legal justification under any law enforcement standard. Confrontation was attracting attention. Pedestrians in busy commercial districts stopped to watch, some recognizing Patterson as local police chief, others simply sensing something deeply wrong about federal agent harassing professionally dressed man on sidewalk at midday. Several people began filming with cell phones, capturing scene from multiple angles. Nearby shop owner, man knowing Patterson from local business council meetings, came out to see what was happening and was visibly shocked seeing police chief being confronted by federal agent. He called out asking if Chief Patterson needed assistance, calling Patterson by name and title, intervention that should have immediately signaled to Morrison he'd made catastrophic error. But instead of backing down, Morrison interpreted witnesses' presence and support for Patterson as challenge to his federal authority, and he escalated further. Morrison reached for radio and called for backup, reporting he had uncooperative suspect refusing identification during immigration investigation and requesting additional agent support. Characterization was completely distorted, transforming encounter where Morrison had illegally stopped citizen without cause into narrative where Patterson was criminal suspect obstructing federal officer. Patterson heard radio transmission and immediately understood Morrison was creating false official record that could be used to justify arrest or use of force. Patterson pulled his own phone and called directly to his police chief office, reaching his deputy chief David Chen, who answered immediately. Patterson succinctly explained he was being illegally detained by ICE agent in front of Walker Coffee without reasonable cause, and he needed Riverside officers responding to scene to document what was happening and potentially intervene if situation escalated to physical arrest. Chen was initially confused, thinking maybe he'd misheard, but when Patterson repeated he, police chief, was being stopped and questioned by ICE agent demanding immigration documents, Chen immediately understood gravity. He assured Patterson he'd dispatch officers immediately and would also contact mayor's office and city attorney because this was clearly incident requiring high-level oversight. While Patterson was on phone, Morrison ordered him to hang up and put phone on ground, another unlawful order demonstrating Morrison was operating completely outside appropriate authority limits. Patterson ignored order, finishing his call with Chen before turning attention back to Morrison. He said calmly, but clearly, he'd contacted Riverside Police Department. Officers were en route, and Morrison should be prepared to explain his actions to supervisors, understanding exactly how seriously he'd violated federal guidelines and constitutional rights. Marked ICE van arrived approximately 4 minutes later, 3 additional agents stepping out, including Morrison's field supervisor, man named Agent Thomas Crawford, having 15 years with ICE. Crawford approached scene and immediately recognized something was wrong with setup. Man in business suits surrounded by small crowd of supporters. Cell phone cameras filming from multiple angles. Tension level, suggesting this wasn't routine immigration stop, but something having escalated significantly. Crawford approached Morrison and asked for situation status. Morrison explained he'd stopped man for immigration check, but suspect was refusing to provide identification and had called in third-party interference. That characterization omitted crucial facts. Morrison had no reasonable cause for stop, and interference was actually local police chief contacting his own department about being illegally detained. Crawford turned to look directly at Patterson for first time, making quick assessment of man in expensive suit, confident posture, crowd clearly supporting him, and multiple cameras documenting everything. Something about Patterson's demeanor immediately signaled to Crawford this wasn't typical immigration stop, but before he could ask more questions, 2 Riverside police cruisers arrived at scene, with Deputy Chief Chen personally stepping out of first vehicle. Chen was a 24-year veteran, having worked alongside Patterson for over a decade. An expression on his face seeing his chief being confronted by federal agents was mixture of disbelief and barely contained anger. Chen walked directly to Patterson, completely ignoring ICE agents initially, and asked if Chief was okay and if he needed assistance. Patterson calmly responded he was fine, but was being illegally detained without reasonable cause, and he'd appreciate Chen documenting entire encounter and ensuring his constitutional rights were protected. Chen then turned to Crawford and Morrison, his voice professional but with steel edge, making clear he wasn't impressed with their federal authority. He identified himself as Riverside Deputy Police Chief and informed ICE agents they were currently detaining Riverside Police Chief without apparent cause, and unless they could articulate specific reasonable suspicion of immigration violation, they needed to end detention immediately. Crawford looked from Chen to Patterson, and realization of what had happened was visible on his face. His expression went from confusion to horror as he processed Morrison had stopped and harassed Police Chief of City, where they were conducting operations, not just any officer, but highest-ranking official in entire department, based apparently on nothing more than Patterson's race. Crawford immediately began verbally backpedaling, saying clearly there'd been misunderstanding, and if Patterson was indeed local police chief, then, obviously, there was no issue about his status. But Patterson wasn't letting that characterization stand unchallenged. He responded, "There was no misunderstanding whatsoever. Morrison had deliberately stopped him based on racial appearance, without any behavior or circumstance suggesting possible immigration violation, and trying to frame this as misunderstanding instead of illegal racial profiling was dishonest and part of exactly the problem with how immigration enforcement was being conducted." Patterson continued, his voice gaining strength as he spoke not just to agents, but to growing witnesses and cameras documenting everything, explaining he was American citizen born in America, had served in law enforcement nearly 3 decades, was police chief responsible for public safety of this entire city. But none of that had prevented federal agent from assuming he didn't belong in his own country based solely on color of his skin. He pointed out if this could happen to him, with all his position and authority, then certainly it was happening to countless other citizens and legal residents of color not having resources or platform to challenge such treatment. Morrison tried to interrupt, saying Patterson was making this about race when it was simply about immigration law enforcement. But that defense crumbled under even superficial scrutiny. Chen asked Morrison directly what specific behavior or circumstance had created reasonable suspicion. Chief Patterson was undocumented immigrant. Morrison struggled to respond, eventually saying something vague about Patterson being in target area for immigration, sweep, and matching demographic profile. Chen immediately challenged that, asking what specifically about Patterson's appearance or behavior suggested immigration violation versus simply being black man in suit. Morrison had no good answer because there wasn't one. His stop of Patterson had been based purely on racial profiling, without any additional factual foundation. Crawford, recognizing situation, was rapidly becoming public relations disaster and potential legal liability for IC, tried to intervene saying agents would end detention and apologize for any inconvenience. But Patterson made clear, apology wasn't sufficient and this wouldn't be treated as minor inconvenience. He informed Crawford he'd be filing formal complaint with ICE Inspector General's office, with Department of Justice, and potentially pursuing civil legal action for violation of his rights under Fourth Amendment and civil rights laws. He also mentioned, as police chief, he had obligation to ensure illegal law enforcement practices were challenged, regardless of which agency was involved. And he wouldn't be silent about experiencing exactly type of illegal racial profiling he'd trained his own officers never to do. Patterson also pointed out entire interaction was being documented by multiple sources, Morrison's own body cam, security cameras from multiple businesses, and dozens of celly phones, meaning there'd be no way to spin or deny what had happened. He suggested Crawford might want to contact his supervisors immediately, because this incident was going to blow up in ways they needed to be prepared to address. Patterson's prediction was absolutely correct. Even while confrontation was happening, videos were being posted on social media by witnesses. Walker Coffee owner, having filmed significant portion of encounter from inside his shop, posted clip with caption explaining city's police chief was being harassed by ICE in broad daylight without apparent reason. That video began circulating immediately in local social media groups, then was picked up by activists recognizing significance of high-ranking black law enforcement official being racially profiled by federal agents. Within hours, story was trending locally with hashtags about ICE racial profiling and federal authority abuse. Local news outlets were contacting police department and mayor's office for comment, and national civil rights organizations were beginning to take notice of videos showing what appeared to be flagrant example of racial profiling by federal agents. Riverside Mayor Jessica Torres arrived at scene approximately 15 minutes after Riverside officers responded. Having been informed by her staff about situation and recognizing this required her personal presence and attention. Torres, having worked closely with Patterson on numerous city initiatives and respecting him immensely, was visibly disturbed seeing scene of her police chief surrounded by federal agents and local officers. She immediately approached Patterson, asked if he was okay, and then turned to Crawford demanding explanation for why federal agents had stopped her city's police chief without apparent cause. Crawford, now clearly out of his depth dealing with elected officials and media beginning to arrive, said he was reviewing situation and any concerns would be addressed through appropriate channels. Torres responded, appropriate channels would include her contacting members of Congress overseeing ICE, she'd personally call ICE regional director, and city would consider suspending any cooperation with ICE operations until they got assurances such illegal racial profiling wouldn't be tolerated. Arrival of local news crews transformed scene into complete media circus. Reporters with professional cameras began recording, news anchors doing live broadcasts explaining they were at location, where Riverside Police Chief had been stopped by ICE agents in what appeared to be racial profiling case. Patterson, recognizing media attention, provided platform to address broader systemic issues, agreed to make brief statement. He spoke directly to cameras, his voice calm but firm, explaining as police chief and American citizen born in country, he'd been stopped by ICE agent without any reasonable cause based apparently solely on his race. He emphasized this wasn't about him personally feeling offended, but about pattern of immigration enforcement, violating constitutional rights of citizens and legal residents through racial profiling that was illegal and morally indefensible. Patterson also made clear he'd use every resource at his disposal as high-ranking law enforcement official to ensure this incident was fully investigated and reforms implemented to prevent similar abuses. Patterson's statement was broadcast live on multiple news channels and posted instantly on social media platforms where it began accumulating millions of views. Image of articulate professional black police chief, calmly describing being racially profiled by federal agents in his own city, resonated powerfully with audiences across political lines. Conservatives generally supporting aggressive immigration enforcement struggled to defend stopping high-ranking law enforcement official without cause. Liberals pointed to incident as perfect example of why ICE practices needed oversight and reform. But perhaps most significantly, countless people of color shared story with comments about experiencing similar treatment, but without Patterson's position or resources to challenge it, recognizing if this could happen to police chief, then certainly it was happening routinely to ordinary citizens, not having national audience when they complained. Crawford finally received orders from his own supervisors to remove all ICE agents from scene immediately and report for emergency briefing. Before leaving, he tried once more to offer formal apology to Patterson, but Patterson cut that off saying apologies were inadequate and he expected full investigation not just of Morrison's actions, but practices of entire unit having conducted racial profiling-based immigration sweep through Riverside. Patterson also informed Crawford Riverside Police Department would be reviewing any ICE requests for cooperation or assistance in immigration enforcement. And until there were assurances ICE was operating within constitutional limits, Citi would suspend most collaboration. That threat had real weight, because local police departments across country had increasingly pulled back from ICE cooperation over concerns ICE practices undermined community trust and exposed cities to legal liability. Following, days brought avalanche of developments. Videos of Patterson's encounter with Morrison reached over 37 million combined views across various platforms within 72 hours. Hashtags related to incident trending nationally for days. Civil rights organizations, including ACLU, Male Deaf, and NAACP, issued statements condemning Patterson's racial profiling and calling for comprehensive reforms of immigration enforcement practices. Numerous members of Congress, both Democrats and some Republicans from districts with significant diverse populations, demanded hearings on ICE practices and whether racial profiling pattern was systemic within agency. House Judiciary Committee announced formal investigation into ICE enforcement practices, focusing specifically on allegations of racial profiling and stops without adequate reasonable cause. Department of Justice opened civil rights review of ICE operations in Riverside and surrounding jurisdictions to determine if there was pattern or practice of racial discrimination in enforcement activities. Patterson was invited to testify before congressional committees, appear on national news programs, and speak at conferences about immigration enforcement reform. He selectively accepted those invitations, using platform to educate about constitutional limits of immigration enforcement authority and need to train federal agents on recognizing and preventing racial profiling. In interview with national news outlet, Patterson articulated point resonating widely, that immigration law enforcement, like any other form of law enforcement, had to be conducted within constitutional limits, and Fourth Amendment had no immigration exception, allowing government to stop people based solely on race. He also shared statistics from his own department's research, showing when police relied on racial profiling instead of real investigative work, they not only violated rights but were also less effective at actually catching criminals because they were spending resources harassing innocent people instead of focusing on legitimate investigations. ICE's internal investigation into Morrison's actions revealed even more disturbing pattern than single incident suggested. Reviewers found Morrison had conducted 147 stops during 3-week sweep operation in Riverside, and 138 of those stops had been of people of color. Of all those stops, only 9 resulted in any enforcement action because vast majority of people stopped were citizens or legal residents Morrison had harassed without justification. Statistical analysis by law enforcement discrimination expert demonstrated pattern was so extreme it couldn't possibly be explained by non-racial factors, unless one absurdly believed being Latino or Black in Riverside somehow correlated with 97% likelihood of being undocumented immigrant, when actual demographic data showed overwhelming majority of Latino and Black residents were citizens or legal residents. Investigation also found Morrison's supervisors, including Crawford, knew of stop numbers, but never questioned obvious racial disparities or reviewed whether stops were based on adequate reasonable cause versus racial profiling. Internal emails obtained through FOIA request by civil rights organizations revealed pressure from higher levels of ICE administration to demonstrate high arrest numbers had created culture where agents felt encouraged to use shortcuts, including racial profiling, instead of conducting adequate investigative work. One particularly damning memo from regional supervisor 6 months before Patterson's incident instructively told field agents not to worry excessively about legal niceties when conducting enforcement sweeps and focus on producing numbers that will make us look good politically. That email would provide basis for arguments in subsequent litigation. ICE's illegal practices weren't just problem of bad agents, but institutional policy coming from agency leadership. Department of Justice would eventually use those emails as evidence in its own pattern or practice lawsuit against ICE operations in region. Civil lawsuit Patterson filed was formidable legal document of 207 pages establishing precedent on constitutional limits of immigration enforcement. Petition named Morrison individually, Crawford as supervisor, having failed to adequately supervise, ICE regional director, and United States federal government as defendants. alleging Fourth Amendment violations for stop and detention without reasonable cause, Fifth Amendment violations for denial of due process, and civil rights violations for intentional racial discrimination in law enforcement. More significantly, petition included institutional policy allegations, arguing ICE's illegal practices weren't aberrations of individual agents, but result of inadequate policies and training from high levels of agency. Patterson sought $5 million in compensatory and punitive damages, but made clear in public statements money was secondary to need for systemic reforms protecting citizens and legal residents from race-based harassment by federal agents. Petition included as evidence not just video recordings from multiple sources showing Patterson's stop, but also comprehensive statistical analysis of Morrison's 147 stops during sweep operation, demonstrating patterns so extreme of racial disparity, expert described as one of most flagrant examples of systematic racial profiling by law enforcement agent I've reviewed in 30 years, analyzing police discrimination cases. Petition also included internal emails showing ICE supervisors knew agents were stopping people based on race, but had instructed agents to prioritize arrest numbers over constitutional compliance. Statements from other victims of Morrison's stops were attached, including American citizen nurse detained 45 minutes while heading to work because Morrison didn't believe her valid identification, and businessman handcuffed publicly outside his own restaurant before finally being released when manager brought birth. Certificate from office file. Federal government's response was initially defensive and combative. Government lawyers argued ICE agents had broad authority to conduct immigration investigations, and Morrison had acted in good faith based on his training. They tried invoking qualified immunity for Morrison, arguing rights violated weren't clearly established in immigration enforcement context. But those defenses were extraordinarily weak given Supreme Court had established decades earlier race-based stops violated Fourth Amendment, and numerous circuit cases had specifically applied those principles to immigration enforcement context. Government's attempt to distinguish immigration enforcement from other forms of law enforcement as somehow not subject to standard constitutional protections was met with skepticism by legal commentators and would eventually be rejected by court. Discovery in case revealed shocking extent of illegal practices within ICE operations. Depositions of other agents revealed culture within enforcement unit emphasized making quick arrests instead of conducting adequate investigations, and agents questioning whether stops were constitutionally justified were reprimanded by supervisors or marginalized as not being team players. One agent, having refused to participate in racial profiling, sweeps and filed internal complaint about illegal practices, testified he'd been retaliated against through negative performance reviews and eventually forced out of agency. That testimony established not just ICE's illegal practices were systemic, but agency actively punished those trying to follow law and object to constitutional violations. Emails from high-ranking ICE officials discussing need to not let legal concerns get in way of aggressive enforcement provided textual evidence of institutional policy, prioritizing political numbers over constitutional rights. Morrison was deposed for 7 hours over 2 days, and his testimony was devastating for any attempt to defend his actions. Confronted with video recordings showing his stop of Patterson, Morrison couldn't articulate any specific fact beyond Patterson's race having created reasonable suspicion of immigration violation. When asked if he would have stopped white man, dressed identically and behaving identically, Morrison hesitated for a long time before eventually admitting he probably not, because white man wouldn't fit the profile. That admission his profile was race-based was exactly type of testimony transforming possible cases into slam-dunk cases. Patterson's lawyers pressed Morrison on his training, and he had to admit both ICE Academy training and agency policy guidelines specifically instructed agents race alone couldn't constitute reasonable cause for immigration. Stop, meaning his actions violated not just constitutional standards, but ICE's own policies. Crawford was equally damaging in his deposition, trying to defend inadequate supervision of Morrison. When asked why, he'd never questioned why 97% of Morrison's stops were people of color. Crawford said he'd assumed that reflected demographics of areas being targeted for enforcement, But when shown actual demographic data proving areas where Morrison was operating were much more racially diverse than his stops suggested, Crawford had no explanation beyond admitting he'd never actually reviewed whether Morrison's stops were based on adequate reasonable cause. When asked if he'd provided any guidance or training to Morrison on avoiding racial profiling, Crawford had to admit he'd focused entirely on pushing for higher arrest numbers and never discussed constitutional compliance. That testimony established not just Crawford had failed to adequately supervise, but he'd actively encouraged illegal practices by pushing for numbers without reviewing methods. Patterson was deposed, and his testimony provided powerful contrast with ICE agents' evasive accounts. Patterson calmly, methodically described exactly what had happened, using his decades of experience as law enforcement officer to explain precisely how Morrison had violated standard protocols any competent officer should know. He testified about impact of being treated as criminal suspect in his own city where he'd served nearly 3 decades, about humiliation of having to prove his right to exist in country, where he was born to federal agent, assuming illegality based on racial appearance. More importantly, Patterson testified about broader implications, explaining as police chief he received regular reports from residents of color being stopped by ICE without apparent cause, and before his own incident, he'd found it difficult to believe federal agents really operated so flagrantly outside constitutional limits. Experiencing it personally had forced him to recognize complaints he'd heard from community members weren't exaggerations, but accurate descriptions of how ICE was operating in his city. Case attracted. Numerous amicus curiae briefs from civil rights organizations, law enforcement associations, and immigration advocacy groups. American Civil Liberties Union filed brief detailing dozens of similar cases across country where ICE agents had stopped citizens and legal residents based on racial profiling. International Association of Chiefs of Police filed brief arguing ICE's racial profiling practices undermined local police departments' efforts to build community trust and law compliance. Brief from 17 states led by state attorneys. General argued IC practices were creating legal liability for states and local jurisdictions, forced to respond to civil rights complaints about federal harassment of their residents. Weight of that institutional support demonstrated Patterson's case was an isolated issue, but touched on widely shared concerns about whether ICE was operating within appropriate constitutional limits. The case was resolved through historic settlement, 16 months after incident. Settlement representing not just victory for Patterson, but establishing precedent for how federal immigration enforcement had to operate within constitutional limits. Federal government agreed to pay Patterson $4,700,000 in damages, one of largest amounts ever paid in immigration enforcement racial profiling case, reflecting both severity of constitutional rights violation and embarrassment of having stopped police chief without cause. Morrison was permanently terminated from ICE, and his federal enforcement authority revoked, ensuring he'd never work in federal law enforcement again. Crawford was demoted and transferred to administrative position without field agent supervision, effectively ending his career in operational enforcement. ICE regional director, having overseen sweep operation, resigned under pressure 3 weeks after settlement was announced, acknowledging he'd created culture prioritizing political numbers over constitutional compliance. But, as in all cases Patterson had observed and admired throughout his career, money and individual consequences weren't the most transformative part of settlement. Mandated structural reforms would fundamentally reshape how ICE operated, not just in Riverside, but establish standard other regions would eventually adopt. ICE was required to implement National Enforcement Accountability Monitoring System, tracking all agent stops, analyzing data by race, ethnicity, and geographic location to identify racial profiling patterns. System had to be administered by independent monitor, jointly selected by government and civil rights groups, and any agent whose stops showed statistically significant racial disparity would be automatically flagged for mandatory review, additional training, and possible reassignment or discipline. System data had to be reported publicly quarterly, creating unprecedented transparency about how Immigration Enforcement Authority was being exercised. All ICE agents were required to complete comprehensive new training program on constitutional limits of immigration enforcement authority and recognizing and preventing racial profiling. But instead of just classroom module, training had to be rigorous ongoing program, including 60 hours initial instruction, covering constitutional law, civil rights, de-escalation techniques, and culturally competent policing, followed by mandatory 12-hour quarterly updates. Curriculum had to be developed in partnership with law schools, civil rights organizations, and local police departments having successfully implemented racial profiling reforms. Crucially, training included Patterson's case, a central example of what constitutes illegal racial profiling, with video recordings used to demonstrate precisely how Morrison had violated Patterson's constitutional rights and what alternatives he should have followed. Agents failing to demonstrate adequate understanding through regular assessments couldn't perform independent stops or detentions until successfully completing remedial training. Settlement established Immigration Enforcement Civil Rights Advisory Council, independent 13-member body, including constitutional experts, civil rights advocates, local law enforcement leaders, and community members from immigrant and communities of color. Council had authority to review any complaints involving allegations of racial profiling or constitutional violations by ICE agents, complete access to body cam recordings and incident reports, power to interview agents and witnesses, and authority to make binding recommendations on agent discipline and policy changes in cases where they found evidence of racial discrimination or constitutional violation. Council recommendations could only be overturned by 2/3 vote, a review panel of senior ICE officials after formal hearing, where agency had to articulate specific fact-based reasons for rejecting Council's findings, and those justifications also had to be publicly reported. ICE was also required to completely revise its policies on when agents could legitimately stop and question individuals about immigration status. New guidelines made absolutely clear race, ethnicity, perceived national origin, or limited English proficiency alone could never constitute reasonable cause for immigration stop. Agents had to be able to articulate specific behavior or circumstances beyond demographic characteristics, creating reasonable suspicion of immigration violation before stopping anyone. Guidelines provided specific examples of what did and didn't constitute adequate reasonable cause, using real incidents including Patterson's stop as case studies of violations. Supervisors were required to review and approve operational plans for enforcement sweeps before implementation, ensuring operations were based on specific intelligence rather than broad demographic profiling of entire areas or populations. Settlement included provision creating Immigration Rights Legal Assistance Fund, financed by portion of settlement payment plus ongoing federal contributions, providing free legal representation for individuals alleging they'd been illegally stopped or harassed by ICE agents based on racial profiling. Patterson personally contributed $1 million of his settlement to that fund, recognizing he'd had resources to fight, but most victims of immigration racial profiling were people without means to pay lawyers or navigate complex legal system. Fund also supported community education about constitutional rights during immigration enforcement encounters, ensuring residents of color understood they didn't have to answer ICE agents' questions without reasonable cause and had right to refuse searches and file complaints if they felt they'd been racially profiled. Media coverage of settlement and reforms it mandated was extensive and generally positive. Civil rights organizations hailed settlement as important victory, establishing precedent federal immigration. Enforcement wasn't exempt from constitutional scrutiny, and federal agents didn't have unlimited authority to stop people based on race. Law enforcement associations, including International Association of Chiefs of Police, issued statements supporting reforms and noting Patterson had demonstrated exactly type of leadership profession needed, officer willing to challenge illegal practices even when coming from federal agents, and even when it would have been easier personally to simply let it go. Some critics argued reforms would make immigration enforcement less effective by constraining agents' ability to conduct broad sweeps. But proponents pointed out data from Morrison's own case showed racial profiling was actually ineffective, with 97% of his stops resulting in no enforcement action because vast majority of people he harassed were citizens or legal residents. Patterson used portion of his settlement not designated for legal assistance fund to establish Center for Excellence in Constitutional Policing at local university. Center providing advanced training for law enforcement officers at all levels on recognizing and preventing racial profiling, conducting stops and investigations within constitutional limits, and building community trust through respectful enforcement practices. Center offered free training for federal agents, state officers, and local police, with curriculum developed by combination of legal academics, experienced law enforcement officers, and community members having experienced racial profiling. Patterson served as founding director of Center, using his experience both as racial profiling victim and longtime police chief to inform training approach both legally rigorous and practically applicable for officers working in field. Story attracted international attention, with media outlets and dozens of countries reporting on American police chief being racially profiled by federal immigration agents in his own country. For many international observers, incidents symbolize deeper tensions in American society about race, immigration, and how far government authority could go in name of enforcement. Human rights organizations included Patterson's case in reports on racial profiling in the United States, using it as example of how discriminatory practices operated at highest levels of government despite explicit constitutional protections against race-based discrimination. Some countries cited case when issuing travel warnings for their citizens of color visiting United States, cautioning they might be stopped by American authorities based on racial appearance regardless of legal status. Morrison tried appealing his termination through union grievance process, arguing he'd been scapegoated for practices encouraged by supervisors, but all review panels watched video recordings of his stop of Patterson reviewed statistical analysis of his 147 stops, showing flagrant racial profiling, and read emails from him describing his approach of stopping anyone who looks like they might be illegal, language demonstrating explicit racial bias no amount of excuse about supervisor pressure could justify. His appeals were denied at every level, and attempts to find law enforcement work at any level were frustrated by fact. Any online search of his name revealed viral videos of him harassing police chief and extensive documentation of his systematic racial profiling practices. He eventually left law enforcement completely. His career destroyed by same cameras he'd trusted would document his work, but instead captured his constitutional violations. Immigration Enforcement Civil Rights Advisory Council proved extraordinarily effective in first years. Council reviewed 217 racial profiling complaints in first 3 years of operation, sustained 143 of those complaints after full investigation, and made recommendations resulting in 32 additional agent terminations, 87 suspensions, and mandatory remedial training for 362 agents showing patterns of allowing racial bias to influence enforcement decisions. More significantly, mere knowledge independent oversight existed with real authority changed agent behavior preventatively. Statistical analysis of IC stops showed 64% reduction in racial disparities in 3 years after settlement reforms implementation, and racial profiling complaints dropped 71%, suggesting combination of better training, increased monitoring, and real consequences for discrimination was having transformative impact on enforcement culture. Patterson continued serving as Riverside Police Chief for 5 more years after settlement, using his elevated platform from case to advocate for law enforcement reforms at local, state, and federal levels. He testified before congressional committees multiple times about need for all law enforcement agencies, including federal, to operate within constitutional limits and build community trust through respectful practices. He served on Presidential Task Force on 21st Century Policing, contributing to recommendations on preventing racial profiling and ensuring accountability when violations occurred. His voice carried particular weight because he could speak both as high-ranking law enforcement official and as racial profiling victim, providing perspective, helping bridge gaps between communities advocating reform and officers concerned reforms would interfere with effective law enforcement. When Patterson finally retired as police chief at 60, he was honored not just by Riverside City, but by national law enforcement and civil rights organizations, recognizing his contributions to advancing constitutional law enforcement. His retirement speech reflected on incident with Morrison, noting while it had been humiliating and infuriating to be treated as criminal suspect in his own city, experience had strengthened his commitment to ensuring no one else, regardless of race or position, would be treated that way by agents under his supervision, or to extent he could influence by any law enforcement agent operating in America. He emphasized case hadn't been about him personally getting revenge against Morrison, but about using moment to create systemic change, protecting everyone's constitutional rights. Patterson's story transcended being just legal case or personal victory. It became defining narrative about limits of government authority, about fact no one, not even federal agents, was above constitutional law, and about possibility of transforming injustice into force for reform. Body cam recordings capturing Patterson's stop by Morrison, originally intended to protect agents from false accusations, instead became irrefutable evidence of systematic racial profiling within ICE and Catalyst for reforms transforming how federal immigration enforcement operated. $4,700,000 made headlines, but true legacy were policies still protecting citizens and legal residents years later, still ensuring immigration enforcement authority was exercised within constitutional limits, and still serving as reminder race alone could never justify government suspicion or interference with individuals' liberty. Case established precedent cited in dozens of subsequent cases challenging ICE practices, and reforms it mandated were eventually voluntarily adopted by ICE regions across country. Recognizing racial profiling was not just unconstitutional, but also ineffective and corrosive to law enforcement legitimacy.